So we'll have plenty of time for discussion. I think people are still trickling in, so I'll go a little bit slowly and just do a brief introduction to Sushma Raman, who's our speaker for the Global Studies Colloquium this week. And I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to welcome her, if virtually, to Santa Barbara. She's an old friend that we've known from our graduate days in Los Angeles, and also someone I've admired in her self-made and original career path. So she's worked in various parts of the nonprofit sector, from the George Soros Foundation to Ford Foundation, Open Society Initiative, and so on and so forth. So I've been actually wanting to bring her for many reasons, not the least of which she's someone who has been, building capacity in global institutions, but also being able to establish a dialogue between activists and grassroots organizing around social justice, as well as policymakers. So that's a sort of a rare interface. And I think that's something that all of us are interested in one way or another. So there are several people here. I see many people, some people from film and media studies and others who are in this world of an expanding telecommunications infrastructure and environmental damage. It is a time that many of us are interested in thinking about new rights, or how we can think about human rights once more. So Sushma is currently the executive director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. And she's coming to us with a new book today that she co-authored with Bill Schulz, the former CEO of Amnesty International in the US. And the book, here it is The Coming Good Society: Why New Realities Demand New Rights. And this was out from Harvard University last year. So with that introduction, let me turn it over to Sushma.
Thank you so much, Bishnu. I'm really delighted to be here, although I'd much rather be in Santa Barbara with the beautiful balmy weather and the palm trees and the ocean and the beautiful landscape. So, but it's delightful to join all of you today. And the weather in Cambridge is pretty nice, actually. So I wanted to just start by sharing a little bit about my background, and Bishnu gave you some of that context. So I like to refer to myself as a PhD doer. So I'm really a practitioner in the university setting now. And I started my career working in more grassroots organizations. I was born and raised in India, came to the US to go to college, and then have been working in the NGO sector and then in philanthropy. And then I've been at the Kennedy School now for several years. I was a California resident for a long time, and I also taught at UCLA and USC in the schools of public policy. So it's really wonderful to kind of come full circle back to the California community and to reconnect with Bishnu and Bhaskar, amongst others. A bit of a word about my co-author, Bill Schulz, who some of you might know. Bill was the former executive director of Amnesty International USA, and really a formidable human rights advocate, public speaker, thinker, one of the most strategic people I know. I met Bill several years ago. We were both judges for the RFK Human Rights International Human Rights Prize, which is a prize awarded annually to a human rights activist. Usually it's someone we would not have heard of in the news. And they get a call one day from Ethel Kennedy saying they've been selected for this award. And then they get 5 to 6 years of not just financial support, but also legal support, communication support, advocacy help, and so on, to really help their organization and movement grow. So we kept in touch. We actually worked together. And then this book was the sort of logical outcome of our work together. Our feeling was that oftentimes people embedded in rights context are focused on the here and now, the current day challenges, the attacks on rights from authoritarians, the issues we care about. And very often we're not looking ahead to the horizon. So how do we think about both balancing the current urgent needs of the day, but also thinking ahead and looking to the horizon. So we both have very different backgrounds, academic trainings, experiences, life experiences, but we try to bring those perspectives together. And I have to say the book was really a learning exercise for me. And I think there's still sort of room to grow, because a lot of these issues are things that we are looking to the horizon. And the book is not necessarily meant to predict a particular path or to prescribe a set of future rights, but rather to provoke our thinking and possibly our collective action for the future. So what we propose is that rights are not static, permanent, or perpetual, and they don't stay the same from generation to generation. We might see some rights evolve over time and change depending on changing norms and circumstances. In some cases, of course, we might see rollbacks of rights, as we have seen recently in the United States, but also many other places around the world. And then in other contexts, new rights might arise that few people might have thought of before. And when that happens, we might think of it as undergoing a revolution. And so this is a premise of our book, which we did not think was particularly controversial, but it turned out to be quite controversial among academics within, within the university, but also beyond. And many academics and even practitioners might say that in the face of assault on rights from authoritarians, we should really narrow our focus on the most essential rights, such as the right to live free from torture, or to ground them in something eternal and permanent. And what we do in the book is really argue the opposite. Traditional understandings of rights as indestructible have not dissuaded authoritarians from dismantling rights and attacking rights claimants. And every generation has had to grapple with this expansion of rights. Just think in the past half century about expansion of rights for women, LGBTQ communities, members of racial minority groups, as well as indigenous communities. And we've also had to contend with the rollback of rights and the full-on assault on rights. So, I'm going to just lay out a couple of issues that we tackle in the book. One related to the reconceptualization of an existing right due to technological enhancements, and one a new right. And again, we don't mean to prescribe or to predict the future, but really to lay out a set of considerations for us as we think about the future horizon for rights. And then I'd love to have a conversation with all of you to answer your questions about the book or anything else that you might like to chat about in the rights domain. So have you ever prayed in a mosque, frequented a gay bar, registered at an online dating site, or visited an abortion clinic? Have you eaten a beef burger in India, clicked on a link to a dissident website in China, or participated in a protest against corruption in Mexico? Government agencies and police departments can gain access to even the most personal facts about you. Facts like these with the click of a button, thanks to increasingly sophisticated technological tools. Private companies can too. Your photograph on a social media profile can be combined with your consumer choices to identify all sorts of information about you, some confidential and some public. Whether as citizens or consumers, virtually our every move is being watched, documented, downloaded, shared, coded, and collated with other people's data. New developments in technology are threatening to compromise the right to privacy, an international human right grounded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and codified in over 150 national constitutions. There are several sweeping societal changes that are driving these threats. First, the pervasive use of new technologies, including by private actors, that intrude into all aspects of our private and professional lives. Second, the persistent fear of terrorism that has influenced public policy decisions around the world since 9/11, and the increased digitization and commodification of our public and private lives. Many of these controversial and widely publicized threats to privacy were instituted in the context of the war on terror. The Patriot Act, for example, passed 45 days after 9/11, made it far easier for the US government to track cell phone calls and bank accounts, and initially even what materials we were withdrawing from our public libraries. US courts regularly wrestle with the question of what constitutes legal search and seizure under the Fourth Amendment, and when law enforcement officials need to get warrants to carry them out. But these privacy endangerments don't really are not limited to tracking alleged terrorists or criminals. We wake up to a range of smartphone devices at our home. We have an alarm. We click like on our social media feed, often without even getting out of bed. We turn on our smart televisions. We step onto our smart scale to check our weight. We log our breakfast in an app. We click thumbs up on a song we enjoy. We turn on traffic apps. And barely an hour has passed in our day, and a composite digital picture can be created by these devices of our likes, dislikes, consumer choices, illnesses, religious and romantic preferences, and our most private concerns. Even our children are not immune from such data gathering, because smart toys such as stuffed animals and dolls may have cameras, geo-tracking technology, and voice recorders. And this rise of big data, the compilation and analysis of millions of our self-generated digital footprints, combined with machine-generated data from our smart home devices and machines, is really one of the most complex privacy rights concerns of our time. So we might be tempted to think of the right to privacy as a far less important right than many other rights, like the rights not to be tortured, disappeared, or executed extrajudicially. And indeed, that is often the case. But the reality is that the violation of the latter rights might cause their victims enormous suffering and their lives, but infringements of privacy seems more of like an inconvenience, or it could be something that is optional for us. But the reality is, in many contexts, violations to our privacy go hand in hand with violations of broader political rights. Very often, authoritarian governments are tracking their citizens as well as visitors' every move as a way to identify dissenters, to punish them, or to prevent them from protesting government policies. Violations of these privacy rights are often the canary in the mine shaft to signal violations of rights of a more serious nature. Facial recognition software is something that has been in the news quite a bit. We might think that we own our physical face, but these images of our faces are often taken without our consent in public spaces. And these images are owned and used by a range of government agencies, such as the police and the FBI. The FBI can get access to drivers' photographs without a warrant. And recently, in fact, there's been work done by colleagues at Georgetown that has unveiled how ICE has been getting access to photographs of driver's licenses in order to track down undocumented people in states that have been giving undocumented people driver's licenses. So the police in some states like Florida have body armor equipped with facial recognition software that reveals the identities of those they encounter without the police having to first get permission. So this use of facial recognition is not just limited to use by government agencies. It is possible that we might in the future see billboards where the ads will change to reflect who you are, what you have purchased before. And the person in the ad might be, their face might have a composite of your best friends, which might make you more likely to buy these products. Facebook, Snap, and other social media companies have built vast databases of millions of faces with related information, such as biographical data, contact lists, places you visited, hobbies, and so on. This still all seems somewhat innocuous, but think about the criminal justice system in the US, which uses a threat or risk score to predict whether an individual will commit a crime in the future. This in turn affects whether he or she would be allowed to post bond and in what amount. It could also influence their sentencing. So local law enforcement agencies are increasingly turning to programs that comb through billions of data points, including prior arrests, real estate transactions, web searches, and social media, in order to create these color-coded threat scores. And this can be combined with scans of license plates, social media hashtags, data from cell site simulators, and camera recordings from police cameras, from both police cameras and from private business surveillance systems, all in real time. And this threat score is increasingly being used by police departments when they respond to emergency calls. And this, of course, is a particular concern for African American and other communities of color who've long been subject to forms of discrimination and rights violations. In fact, an investigation by ProPublica revealed that the software algorithm used in the US criminal justice system asked some questions that seem to disproportionately and adversely affect African Americans, even when there's not an explicit question about the individual's race. ProPublica alleged that the algorithm falsely flagged Black defendants as future criminals, wrongly labeling them this way at almost the rate of twice the rate of white defendants. The criminal justice system also relies on facial recognition software, which might have a racial bias problem. African Americans are at least twice as likely as members of other races to be targeted by police surveillance, to be pulled over by police, and to be arrested. This, combined with misidentification by facial recognition and inaccuracy in the underlying algorithms, can lead to devastating consequences. The immigration system in many countries is increasingly using surveillance technologies, not just at the physical borders where you might think that people are crossing or entering, but in communities much beyond these physical borders and in ways that automate these data collection and decision-making efforts. ICE, as I mentioned, uses sophisticated technologies, not just to surveil the border, but also to amass large troves of information on immigrants and US-born alike. And this has significant implications for our privacy, freedoms, and dignity. And around the world, governments are tracking protests on the street, the outrage that is breaking out online, and muzzling the freedom of speech and expression for human rights activists, journalists, anti-corruption advocates, environmental defenders, and LGBTQ activists as well. The coronavirus pandemic has only intensified this tracking and surveillance effort, often in the name of public health. The use of contact tracing apps and other means to track individuals' physical locations and contacts during the pandemic raises questions as to whether these increased surveillance powers will eventually become permanent. While this right to privacy might be a well-established right, we might want to think about how we exercise such a right in the face of these sophisticated technological advancements. Activists in the US have been working on a ban or moratorium on the use of facial recognition technology in cities like Detroit. Human rights groups around the world are protesting the use of surveillance technologies by digital authoritarians who are tracking down journalists, dissidents, and democracy advocates. And the right to be forgotten in Europe allows EU citizens the power to ask that certain sensitive information be removed from search results. Now, if human rights in the digital age are one set of concerns facing communities and societies around the world, another set of concerns we could think about broadly could focus on economic rights in an age of accelerating inequality. Now, human rights are often seen as comprising civil and political rights, such as the right to vote or the right to live free of torture, and then economic, social, cultural rights, such as the right to food or the right of labor. Human rights organizations in the global north are often accused of focusing more on civil political rights than economic rights. But the reality is, in community organizations and social movements around the world, the quest for economic rights and civil political rights are indivisible and seamlessly connected. So very often, indigenous communities are thinking about the right to water. They're also thinking about issues of environmental justice, holding government leaders accountable. So communities are often thinking about these issues seamlessly. One right that we propose in the book, the right to live free from corruption, could really make a significant difference, we believe, in the ability of communities around the world to strengthen economic rights. 750 million people around the world live on less than $2 a day. And the international community could consider this as living really in extreme poverty. Now, many of us are familiar with petty corruption, which has been defined by Transparency International as the everyday abuse of entrusted power by low and mid-level public officials in their interactions with ordinary citizens who are trying to access basic goods and services in places like hospitals, schools, police departments, and other agencies. Petty corruption does affect the poorest of the poor and the most vulnerable. Studies show that poor households in Mexico can lose a quarter of their income to petty corruption. Only 20 cents on the dollar of school funding in Uganda reaches the schools. Far from the poor being a drain on public resources, like many might say, petty corruption actually causes the poor to pay excessively for basic goods and services that reach the rich and middle class automatically. Now, there's grand corruption as well, which refers to corruption at the highest levels of government, where rulers might gain personally at the expense of the public. And of course, these examples of grand corruption abound in the world today. So corruption is linked to human rights, we argue in our book, in at least 4 ways. And corruption in the past was not always viewed in a human rights context. Corruption initially was often seen as the cost of doing business for international companies or multilateral organizations. It then became viewed in more of a financial or economic lens as what is the loss to a country's gross domestic product. But it's only recently that people have been thinking about it within the human rights framework. And we say that it's linked to human rights in at least 4 ways. First, it affects the poor far more than the rich and limits their ability to exercise and achieve a range of economic and political rights and to realize their full human dignity. Second, it hinders the capacity of the state to garner and spend revenues on the basic needs of citizens, which then really affects the ability of the state to meet these economic rights of people. And how does the state then build a good society? Third, the sources of illicit money are often tied to illicit activities that are detrimental to the rights, security, and dignity of millions of already vulnerable people. We might think of labor trafficking or narco trafficking. And finally, and probably the most important, the corrupt design of institutions, laws, policies, and information exchanges benefit the powerful at the expense of those who lack power. So international law does not currently consider corruption a violation of human rights, even though the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, and others have really underscored and emphasized the corrosive effect of corruption in societies, including on rule of law and democracy. The UDHR, the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights don't even mention the word corruption. And we think this is a major gap, and we support the formal establishment of a human right to live free of corruption. Now, why would it be important to recognize such a claim as a right rather than a nice idea or maybe even a public policy? And this is something we've been asked, like, why are you proposing an expansion of rights when our existing rights have not been secured? When something is proclaimed a human right by the international community, it can signal the establishment of a globally recognized norm that cannot just be dismissed as some do-gooder or NGO's conception of a best practice or some nation's particular policy. It really is a feature of human dignity and the good society that has been sanctioned by the world community. And then that triggers all sorts of benefits to people around the world. It allows, for example, grassroots activists to put pressure on governments or corporations with violating standards that are international. It allows one to appeal to UN special rapporteurs or other bodies to expose violations of rights and to ask for accountability. This is why First Lady Hillary Clinton said women's rights are human rights at the 1995 Beijing conference, and it was so resonant to us. It was not that no nation had ever recognized women's rights, but she was saying that these rights ought to be understood more than national kind of preferences. They need to be adopted as universal rights and really are important to having a good society. So these are just 2 examples of rights that we cover in our book in terms of an existing right that we think needs to be, re-examined in the context of, our current technological age, and then a new right that we think would help us in securing a range of other rights. So there's so much more I could talk about, but I think I'll pause at this time and turn it back to you, Bishnu.
Thank you, Sushma, there's lots to talk about. I'm sure people have all kinds of questions. So I'll just start us off. I was very taken in reading the book about your future-oriented conception of rights as a process. That in fact, we don't think about the present, but the rights are rights to come. So there's a kind of a global normativity towards which we work. And I'm thinking of, now the questions around policing, for instance. I mean, it'll be years, for things to actually crystallize as rights, but the activists have been pushing us to rethink the norm, etc. So my question is a broad one. What has the writing this book while you were writing it, and then this year of the pandemic has put health on the forefront, right? So I'm wondering if you could speak to that, because of course we know that economic inequities have exacerbated who gets health. But on the one hand, so that fits your idea of what kinds of new rights emerge. But there's also the question that had it not been for contact tracing, in some communities, we wouldn't have been able to arrest community transmission. And we've seen this all over Asia, right? So there's very mechanisms, and I'm also thinking of the Capitol insurrection, right? The very mechanisms that we have long fought against, like the deadliness of ICE and the war on terror. And now, of course, I want the domestic terrorists to have that risk score, right? So you know what I mean? So that kind of surveillance network is much more confusing to me.
Yes,
Now,
absolutely.
before. So I'll just leave it there.
Yes, absolutely. I think that you raised some really good points. So I'll touch on the pandemic first. As you know, because you're an academic, the process to write a book and get it published by an academic press is long and laborious. So this really was written prior to the pandemic. So, we didn't know what was necessarily, kind of, emerging on that front. But we do touch on gene editing and some of the implications for the right to health when you have like significant health advancements in one domain and people who are left behind. And I think the pandemic has exposed existing inequities and laid bare. So in the last year, we've seen, the tech CEOs expand their wealth, by billions. And then you have people who are deemed essential workers really suffering in terms of lack of labor protections and so on. So I think that, if anything, I think that pandemic has sort of reinforced the relevance and importance of rights for all of us. It's not just something that affects people, who are subject to rights violations. We are all in a way affected by this larger landscape, this transformation due to the pandemic. I do agree that there are very often tensions between, the right to privacy versus, for example, the, ensuring a right to health during a pandemic or during some sort of emergency. I actually wrote an article on the January 6th insurrection. I'll see if I can locate it and put it in the chat or send it to you later. It's in Foreign Policy. And I think, the big dilemma is how do you ensure accountability without strengthening the powers of the surveillance state, right? And there have been efforts to literally track down the people who were involved in January 6th using their very videos and photographs that were uploaded onto Parler and other sites to ensure that we arrest them. But what we found repeatedly, whether it's 9/11 or other contexts, is these technologies then eventually very quickly get used on immigrants and refugees, trans people, religious minority groups, and so on. And so there's just a need to ensure diligence and to ensure that such technologies are not just viewed as neutral and as, sort of increasing our efficiency.
Okay, so the floor is open. Brett, are you going to be adjudicating questions so Sushma can focus on answers? Yeah?
I think you will be the adjudicator here.
Okay, I'll be
You
the
know it.
adjudicator. So you can either put it in the chat or raise your hands.
Allison.
Hi. Well, it's refreshing to hear more on this, the subject of new rights and adapting new rights to new times. That is something I've been engaged with for quite a while. Of course, Bill's previous book, In Our Own Interest, I thought was a very good strategic intervention. I think that's 15 years old now. We've always found that helpful in teaching and bridging from the rights research, academic community and rights policy world. I'm a little surprised that you say you got pushback on the notion of expanding rights. So I wanted, just on behalf of the academic community, at least in my sector of, I was at one point president of the APSA human rights section, and we had quite a number of panels. I mean, so I'm not just speaking in terms of my own publications, and I have an edited volume called Expanding Rights, where we have chapters on water rights, children's rights, indigenous people's rights. So just a very robust community, but also, I mean, I was doing the program for academic conferences, both the ISA, International Studies Association, and the APSA, American Political Science, which in general has tended to be a little more conservative, but within the human rights scholarly community. I'm emphasizing this really for the sake of students and colleagues coming in from other subfields. It's wonderful to have the bridging policy intervention, but there's an open door there on the academic side, and people who are thinking about this and building on it for several years. So I hope I would love to be referred to the people resisting, because I could send them a pile of publications. And there are initiatives. I think that the interdependence of rights, this is actually, it's a strange time in that there is increasing recognition of the interdependence of rights in the academic and the legal communities at the very moment that we may be on the defensive in the policy world. So I guess I'm just trying both to give people a sense that there are ample academic references and scholarly support for things like children's rights, environmental rights, water rights, and those interdependencies. And I would like to do just a shout out. My friend Richard Hiskis is just coming out with a children's rights book that uses the notion of children's rights to interrogate individual versus collective rights, intergenerational rights, identity rights, the interdependence between social economic rights and civil political rights. So I just really want to congratulate you on this book, but also really encourage and ground the conversation. That there's a broader literature out there, and hope that we can really support each other in drawing attention to that. Thanks.
So if I could just respond and say thank you so much for your remarks. It's wonderful to hear that support. I think that, I'm still acclimatizing to the university environment. Being embedded in a university full time is just different. And every university, I think, has its own culture. But I think, at Harvard, there's just definitely some scholars who have been doing this for a long time and think of rights in a very, in a particular manner. And so there have been plenty of people who've actually loved the book, and I think find it very accessible, where it combines both theory but also kind of real world examples from around the world. But then there's also people who feel that we should really focus on sort of core rights issues.
Yeah, I just posted in the chat, just to help people, some key scholars working on the new rights issues, just so that everybody can follow up and we can make sure. I had already posted a health and human rights reference, but some of the people I mentioned, have either edited volumes or kind of, had key interventions that push in the very directions you're going, so that we can support each other. And like I said, give me the names of the people resisting and I will. Thank you.
Okay, so we have some other questions. Jen Holt, where are you, Jen?
Hi, I'm here. Thank you, Bishnu. And thank you, Sushma. I actually don't remember the last time I heard an author talk about their work so clearly, where even in Zoom times, I was riveted on every single word. And this was, I just really want to thank you. I've already, while you were talking, ordered your book, and it's going to move to the top of my stack, which is the highest compliment I can give anybody right now. So this was really great. I'm really, really impressed with what you're doing and super interested. One thing I want to ask is, and I'm sorry if I'm ignorant because I haven't read your book yet. Do you think about rights as they relate to various forms of infrastructure? And for me, I'm excuse me, I'm thinking about like the right to broadband access, which I think has been shown to us during the pandemic to be more than just a right to, stream media, but the right to do your job, the right to be educated, the right to participate in, the collective cultural conversation, all kinds of things, the right to earn a living. So I ask because I think about these things from a regulatory perspective, and I have been writing a lot about the idea of broadband being that it should obviously be regulated as a public utility, which then confers certain rights to a public, right? That they have the right to access it in an equal way, a reduced rate, that kind of thing. Their provision, the provision is not only determined by economic factors. And so I'm just interested if you think about infrastructure in your expanded purview of rights, and I'm really excited to read your book. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And are you at UC Santa Barbara?
Yes, I'm in film and media studies.
Oh, wonderful.
I was a faculty affiliate at the Harvard, the Berkman Klein Center.
Oh,
for a
sure.
year.
Yeah.
So I think I love lawyers, and, I'm a policy nerd, but I like, my people and humanities.
Well,
Yeah,
the
Jen,
Carr Center, sorry,
yeah.
go ahead.
No, I was just saying, Jen is our resident expert on media policy, media regulation. So yeah, I think there are a lot of overlapping interests.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, we at the Carr Center are the sort of smaller version of the Berkman Klein Center. So think Berkman Klein, and then think like the smallest 1% of the Berkman Klein Center, not
That's
the top
great.
1%. So, this is a really interesting question. And I think one of the things we really grappled with was how broad this was. And, we could go so many different ways. And ultimately, because of space, we ended up focusing on some of the issues that we really saw as sort of pushing the field a bit, right? And so we did not look at this issue around right to broadband access, although it connects to this broader context of both digital rights, but then also some of the issues you touched on in terms of, the right to work, economic rights, and so on. So it's interesting, but it's not really covered.
Okay.
But maybe that's the next thing.
Yeah.
Amit Ahuja. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, lovely. Sushma, thank you so much for a fascinating talk and something that actually speaks to my own work in political science in very interesting ways. So, so let me, I have one question, which is, I think, a little bit straightforward. And the other question, which is a little bit more tedious.
Mhm.
So let me start with a straightforward one, which is this, that, in some ways, when you talk about technology and its intrusion in our lives and its widespread usage in our life, and how that's sort of reformulated our notions and ideas of privacy. I'm just sort of thinking about, we've gone from a moment when, or from a time when there, privacy was a universal public virtue. I mean, there's a no-brainer there. And suddenly we were persuaded by the state, by telling us that for the sake of our security, we should allow some degree of intrusion. And of course, the other, whether it was a terrorist or an ethnic group or somebody who wanted to secede, needed to be monitored. So therefore, some degree of privacy violations should be allowed. We were also persuaded by the corporate sector, the private sector, telling us that, look, sure, we collect data, but look at all the good that we are producing by, being around you everywhere and monitoring every aspect of your life. And suddenly, interests have been created around privacy or the violation of privacy, which have completely fragmented and destroyed the universality of that virtue around privacy. When we think about privacy, we sort of, but we have a lot of these, but what if? And surely for those people, we can overlook privacy. And so in some ways, how much, these are the state and the big corporates like Amazon and Facebook and Google, these are powerful entities. And so when you think about reclaiming of the right to privacy, where does power feature in all of this? That's one question. The other question, I think, is a little bit more complicated because I work on both sides of the debate on corruption. On one hand, I completely agree with you that petty corruption is a tax on the poor and it hurts their cause in all kinds of ways. But at the same time, when I look at politics and democratic politics across the world, and I see how expensive electoral politics has become. I mean, in the last Indian election, for example, the total cost was at $7 billion. And that basically means that if you're going to compete in these elections as political parties, you've got to have a lot of cash on hand. Now, if you're running parties that attract dominant groups, wealthy groups, major interests, that money will flow in legally or illegally. But if your parties are poor, your constituents don't have money. The only way you raise money is by capturing some state power and then relying on patronage politics, relying on extra legal means to raise money and survive in politics. Are you corrupt? Sure. Are there other ways to remain competitive in politics? Not really. Do you give voice to the poor? Yes, you do. How do we deal with this dilemma? Like, on one hand, yes, corruption is bad, but on the other hand, for certain groups, corruption is the only way to survive in politics. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, you raised some important points, and I don't know if I could address all of them today, but in our chapter on corruption, we actually talk about how corruption is so sticky and it's so hard to combat, especially at an individual level, right? So if you say, I'm not going to pay a bribe, but everybody else is paying the bribe, then you lose out, right? So where are the incentives for people to take action? And there's actually work that's been done in this space by Fishman and Golden around corruption and ways to think about corruption. But I do think that, the point I made earlier that, corruption changes the design of laws and policies and who's favored. And that's what happened in these instances of political corruption that you speak about, because once people get elected, then they are beholden to certain individuals or organizations, and then policies or government contracts, things get executed based on that. And so I think so I just found the page randomly, so while opening the book, Fishman and Golden describe a corruption as equilibrium framework as the reason it is so difficult to tackle corruption. Corruption happens, they say, as a result of interactions among individuals in which, given the choices others make, no one person can make herself better off by choosing any other course of action. What does this mean in practice? If everyone else is paying a bribe to get their child into a school, if you choose to act honestly, you're basically sacrificing the chance of getting your child enrolled. So the corruption is equilibrium framework. And there's another concept around the corrupting effect of corruption, where being in a corrupt society then kind of engenders more corruption, makes it difficult to end this phenomenon. And we also talk about the fact that even efforts like transparency, which we might think of as a good way to tackle corruption, sometimes have repercussions, because it shows you how people are doing this and kind of amplifies these efforts. So it's a very difficult topic, and we don't pretend that we know all the answers, but we think that this is one way to tackle this, because looking at it from a human rights lens at least allows us to center the needs of the poor and the vulnerable, versus efforts that are just more technocratic in nature, that look at the GDP or look at it from a purely financial lens.
Other questions? I have another one, Sushma, having read all the chapters. I wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about the new rights that go to artificial intelligence and to creatures and rivers and streams and mountains. So this is a part of you say that if you respect water, and water body like a river has rights in the new environmental landscape, thinking about indigenous epistemologies, or if you think of robots and sentient beings having rights, how do we approach this? A central question of equivalence, right? They are not equivalent to humans. How do we approach this conception of rights?
Yeah, so we're not necessarily thinking about these all as equivalent, right? We understand that, we have a current sort of framework of rights that have been developed, but let's just take nature. And there's an article I wrote on Open Global Rights. I'll send you the link after, but we basically say in that nature and ecosystems are another frontier in rights development. So, and this is something that might be a concept that is unusual for some, but in many communities around the world, indigenous communities in Latin America, for example, or New Zealand, this is something that is quite commonplace, to really think of a river as sacred or as an embodiment of a goddess, and then to ensure the protection of such bodies of water and so on. So if human beings were to pollute a river or to strip mine a mountain, are we in some sense violating the dignity of that river or mountain? And in many indigenous cultures, the natural world is seen as being imbued with life, which then demands respect and dignity. And the first recognition of the rights of nature, so we might think of this as a new right, but really this is something that is age old. And the first national recognition of the rights of nature came in 2008 with the ratification of a new constitution in Ecuador, which is one of the most biologically diverse countries on earth. And it's grounded in the indigenous concept of good living or harmonious coexistence. And the Constitution declares that nature, or Pachamama, Mother Earth, has the right to integral respect, maintenance, and regeneration. And 2 years later, Bolivia passed a similar law on the rights of Mother Earth. And the Inter-American Court of Human Rights recognized a fundamental right to a healthier environment in 2018. And the International Criminal Court is addressing crimes that result in environmental destruction. So while we might not think of this as something that fits within our framework of thinking about certain political rights and so on, future generations might think, in fact, even if you think of the generation of people who are in college today or in high school, would probably think it is a very important thing to assign rights to ecosystems, because it's not just essential for the survival of human beings the way we might think of, you know, environmental movements, but also just to treasure nature in and of itself. So, you know, we are also trying to think about rights beyond the broader framework of just human rights. And so that's partially why we kind of approach this around nature. So why don't I just stop there? There's so many other examples I could kind of tap into, but let me see if there's other questions. I think Jan had a question.
He did? Oh, sorry if I missed you, Jan. Jan had a
His
question.
screen had come on.
Okay, Carolina?
Just wanted to add it something to add something like that, and I'm sorry for my very Spanish accent, but yeah. No, it's because about this new framework of the rights of nature. This is part of my work, and what I have seen is that this framework is really local. It's really acting with local knowledges, and it is not really involving only indigenous people. And those examples over the constitutions of Ecuador and Bolivia, I think that everybody knows about it. But they, according to some indigenous people I know, they have caused more troubles than really help. And actually, where the resistance is, and where instead of rights, the idea of stewardship and relationship and complementarity emerge, is in indigenous people. So there you have the real resistance to protect nature against multinationals and against the capital. It is a very delicate new legal framework. And I would like to use the occasion to warn you all not to globalize this, because what I have seen is that this framework is working in very local courts. The River Atrato, for instance, now in Colombia, did allowed for the river to have legal personality, but it was not based in the concept of rights that we know. It was based on people knowledge and relation. So in that court, they were talking about the biocultural rights instead of human rights. So this a bit to go a bit further than the Convention of Stockholm, that we have the right for a clean environment and so on. This is a bit further, and it was the first time I hear about it, biocultural rights. And it, all this emergence, this emerging framework is really feeding with local knowledge. And I think it's a very big mistake to talk in terms of a global thing, because it is not. If you make it globally, we'll kill it.
So I think you raise a really important point in terms of thinking about, and this happens actually in other on other issues as well, right? Where sometimes thinking of framing issues in a global context can backfire to the perceived legitimacy of these efforts locally. And we're seeing this around the world, where people often attack rights as a Western notion, or as something that's being imposed from the outside. So I think that's a really important point to really think about sort of the particularity of the issues as how they arise in different countries and contexts and communities, and also thinking about how and when one should connect dots between these different movements, and are there relevant kind of frameworks that bring these together across these contexts and cultures. So thank you.
That is a very good example. As you mentioned, the Constitution of Ecuador, they say, for instance, they talk about the Buen Vivir, but the Buen Vivir, I mean, yeah, it was a creation of Ecuadorian intellectuals with some people that started to translate indigenous knowledge, and they came together into an idea of Buen Vivir. But the Buen Vivir in indigenous languages, summa causae. And further than summa causae, they have now the causa satia, that is an idea of forest as a living entity. Yeah, but those words and those knowledges, they are part of the forest, of the tropical rainforest. They don't have absolutely any meaning beyond that. And while they stay in the forest and they protect the trees and the forest as a living entity, they have power. You start to use them too much, you vandalize it.
Okay, can we go on to another? I know, Sushma, you have to buzz your son.
Yes, sorry, I just need 1 second. The advantage or the disadvantage of Zoom from home. Give me 1 second. I just need to buzz him in.
Okay, go buzz your son in. Yeah.
Just to help bridge there, I posted for everybody a website where exactly these kinds of debates are present, and it is the same site on which Sushma published her own engagement. She mentioned, she said, I have, besides the piece in foreign policy, I have this other piece on open global rights. So again, for all people working on the very many aspects of what is a new right, what should be something else, I posted one particular article I was just looking at, but that whole website, and again, Sushma is on there. We can use it to expand her work. But it's also a place where the kinds of challenges that Carolina is raising are there by both activists and academics. So I'm just trying to keep the conversation going and give Sushma a
break. I know it is a weird thing about being on Zoom and having one's house.
But I think the chat has been very good in this case, because we've been all posting different different things and extensions. I think also there's another question now.
Yeah, Constance has a question for Sushma.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Hi, Sushma. Thank you so much for this spectacular talk. It's making me think so many things. May I ask what you think about the Biden-Harris position on rights?
So that's a big question. And I'll start. Okay. I think that the first step is addressing the rollback of rights in the United States. I think the US has been for far too long comfortable with kind of pointing fingers at regimes around the world and acts that they have viewed as violating rights. And, the State Department comes out with these annual reports. But I do think that not that the rights, tradition in the US has always been upheld, but the past 4 years, there have definitely been an increase in both rhetoric and policy action that have been really attacking particularly immigrants and refugees, communities of color, women, and so on. And so I think the first step is really addressing some of these issues. And I wrote a piece in Foreign Policy in November where I outlined some of these issues where, I think the issue of immigration and refugees needs to be addressed. I think kind of it's not just enough to repeal some of the Trump era policies. It's really also thinking in a more forward-looking way to re-examine the asylum system, the policies on the US-Mexico border, which, some of the policies such as remaining in Mexico, where asylum seekers are made to wait there for long periods of time in squalid and dangerous conditions, the policies towards, families with children, where families are separated and detained. Some of these issues really have to be fundamentally addressed. That's the first step. I think issues around racial justice and equity have to be addressed as well. I mean, again, this has been something that the country has been grappling with since its founding. But I do think right now, given sort of the events of the past year, even the events of the past week, there needs to be a firm commitment to that in terms of looking at policing and the criminal justice system. The issue of reparations is on the agenda. So that is really important, but it has to be combined with changes in other policies in order for reparations to be meaningful. So I think the immigration issue, the racial justice issue, I would say also Guantanamo. Guantanamo is important to address. It's been so many years since 9/11 and since Guantanamo was opened, and the majority of people, they have not been charged with anything. So they have been, there's a great movie called The Mauritanian, which if you have not seen it yet, I highly recommend. And it's a true story based on a book called Guantanamo Diary. And, I actually had the, I don't want to say privilege because it's a weird word, but I had the opportunity to go to Guantanamo a few years ago as an observer for the 9/11 pretrial process. And I have to say that really it is a travesty of justice to say that one is holding a certain number of individuals who have not been charged and holding them indefinitely. And in all likelihood, these people will never be able to, be free in the future. And there is no kind of recourse. And this is also for the families of people who were killed in 9/11, where they were hoping to see some closure, and it is probably not going to happen in their lifetime. So I think addressing the issue of 9/11 and the use of torture and enhanced interrogation in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib is also something that is really an imperative. So these are sort of housekeeping on the home front. There's so much more. And then globally, I think resetting with the International Criminal Court, there have been some steps on that front, because the Trump administration had denied visas to the ICC officials and so on. So really, it has to go more than that. And the question is, there are issues with the ICC. There are issues, of course, with the UN Human Rights Council. But then what is the best way? Is it to pull out of these efforts, or is it really to engage and try and shape, an international community? And the reality is that we are now in a multipolar world. And, the US is not the entity in lead with respect to rights. There probably isn't one country as such, but, I think there needs to be a greater engagement with both sort of these global institutions, but also with other countries in terms of joint problem solving and so on. So there's a lot that that needs to happen. But I think what I worry about is that there might be a return to business as usual from the Obama and pre-Obama era around sort of foreign policy and human rights. And I don't mean to be cynical, but I think a lot of that is focused on sort of US interests abroad, as opposed to really thinking about the rights of people who have been most marginalized. And, you saw that very overtly in the Trump administration. I don't know if people are familiar with the creation of the Commission on Unalienable Rights that was set up by Secretary Pompeo, which really kind of set up a hierarchy of rights and privileged sort of religious freedom and kind of deemed certain other rights as too political, meaning LGBT rights. And, that was really attacked by advocates. And, now the State Department has repudiated that commission and report and so on. But I think there has to be a lot of rebuilding that has to happen, and a lot of efforts on the domestic front to demonstrate to the world that the US is committed to rights domestically as well as globally. And I see a question in the chat which says, in the US, how can an emphasis on rights combine with small government ideology? And I think that's a really interesting and important question, because people in the US might not actually think of economic rights as rights, right? Like we don't think of a right to healthcare or education. And these are increasingly becoming privatized, or there's some sort of like public-private approach to these issues. But I think there has always been kind of these, this focus on civil political rights. And there's an interesting article in the Boston Review from a while back, maybe about a year ago, which was called "Is Freedom White?" And I'd encourage you to read that. So, our conceptions of freedoms, one that are kind of, tied to sort of the power structure. So there's a project at the Carr Center called Reimagining Rights and Responsibilities in the United States, which tackles actually many of the issues we've talked about. How do we rebuild rights? How do we emphasize responsibilities? What is the kind of path forward? And we're actually now working on a book based on some of the research findings. So I'll just stop there. I think Daniel had a question I see in the chat. Sorry.
Yes, thanks. I have the feeling that probably you shared your thoughts on this now, but nevertheless, I was sitting here and thinking, because I don't really often think about rights as such, but I found it intriguing to think about new rights. But I was also thinking, what about then the right to enforce new rights, right? So when you think about new rights and the whole discourse and also the agency, where do you think maybe may lay the new institutional settings for new rights that would also ensure sort of to go the step forward away from US hegemonic enforced human rights to a more multipolar, negotiable basis of enforcing new rights?
Yeah, so, one of my colleagues works on this, Catherine Sickink, and then John Shattuck, around the issue of responsibility. So for rights, we must have responsibility. So who is responsible, who's accountable? And, maybe 50 years ago, we saw the state as going to be accountable and responsible for protecting rights. And now we think about corporations, we think about social media and technology companies, and even private citizens, right? So I think what you are proposing is really an important question to really think about as we think of these expanding rights regimes. How do we enforce, or how do we even support? How do we ensure accountability and so on? So this is really a process and not like a final destination, I guess.
Ricardo?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I would like to come back to the question of corruption. And I am interested in how you conceptualize, if we exclude the global South, how do you conceptualize corruption, for example, in the US or in the global North? And what would that look like if you apply the notion of corruption within, say, the US? What would that mean? Because there are certain conceptual frameworks, new patrimonialism, but it has an application outside of its country of origin. So I'm interested in to understand what would that be like for example, in the US. It's a very fascinating issue on human rights and on-corruption, and I'm just
that's a great
try to
question.
understand how you would think about that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that has been happening in the US in a lot of contexts. And, I certainly didn't mean to kind of point a finger at any one country or region. I think, you've had instances, for example, of, judges. There was a case in Pennsylvania where a judge was getting kickbacks and then sentencing juvenile offenders and was getting kickbacks. And so these kinds of instances do occur in the more traditional notion of corruption. I think the last 4 years have shown us sort of the level of corruption at the highest of levels of political office in the country. And I also think that, some things that might be seen as legal, in terms of how political contributions are made and in terms of, how political parties are financed and so on, could be reconceptualized going forward. So there isn't necessarily like a one size fits all, but I do think that it manifests in other ways. The one other thing I will say in the US context is the whole issue of fines and fees and how they affect poor people. So it isn't necessarily like a bribe, that you might have to pay to a police officer, but very often what happens is there is a way in which poor people are sucked into a system where you have to pay a fine or a fee, and then it becomes escalated to a warrant, and that then becomes a system for financing a lot of the budgets of these police departments and so on. So there's different ways to look at it, I think, in the US context. I'm not an expert at that, so I'm just sort of offering some examples. But I do think the issue is one that is really global. It's not just two countries in the global South.
So if I can jump in for a second, Sushma and Ricardo. Ricardo's question made me think of this. I think of corruption also as malfeasance, a breaking of public trust.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets really complicated even with that conceptualization or that definition, because, our friend Chandan Reddy at the University of Washington in Seattle has been looking at all these documents that have become public domain, not really, but because they're University of Washington employees, there's a new law dating back a few years where it's just right of information. So they all documents like that are actually confidential. So what he finds out is that small town liberal Washington state mayors have been set up new prisons as part of the prison industrial system as a way of generating employment in local areas. So the public is also implicated here in the public trust and the public interest, but it is utterly corrupt because these empty spaces that are excess capacity prison systems, they need to be filled up. So people are just getting picked up at the borders and put in there right there. So it's Guantanamo just multiplying all over the US, the liberal bastions of the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, great point. Thank you, Bashpur.
Well, we've worked you very hard. So if there aren't any more questions or comments, I'd like to thank Sushma from UCSB and everyone else who's joined us. And this is to be continued. I can't imagine how big a field this is, but yes.
Well, I've already begun working on my next two projects. So
what are they about?
What are they? Let's close with that.
Actually, I have like several ideas in the works, so we have to translate them. So the first one that's most imminent is a book that brings together our research on reimagining rights and responsibilities in the US around a set of areas such as criminal justice, racial justice, and so on. And so I'm co-authoring that with John Shattuck, who's former US ambassador to the Czech Republic and former president of Central European University, and with Matthias Riese, who's a philosopher and ethicist at the Kennedy School and at the Carr Center as well. So it's really looking at the trajectory of rights in the United States and then making a forward-looking set of recommendations. And so I'm going to be focused on the chapters on race, immigration, and a couple other chapters. So that's imminent and has to be submitted this summer. And then I have a couple other book projects kind of more on the back burner. One is around the intersection of economic and racial justice based on a class that I co-taught in the fall with Matthias, which looked at economic justice theory and practice. So it was a blend of everything from sort of Marx and Milton Friedman to hearing directly from activists in the global South and communities of color in the US around organizing around everything from Black Lives Matter to reparations to indigenous communities in the Amazon and environmental justice issues. So really taking that and kind of synthesizing that, our findings and kind of thinking about that in a forward way. And another project looking at sort of rights in the context of the war on terror, kind of globally.
Well,
so lots of things happening,
yes, become a full-scale academic, but I'm so glad you're the interface between these institutions and us. So thank you, Sushma.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for joining. Next week we're going to be hosting Anthony Giddens, who will be talking about COVID-19, AI, and the future of work. So hope to see you all there. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.